I previously introduced myself, so I'm Jordan Haley. For those of you that do not know, I'm a Liberty grad, and I was previously at the White House in the Department of Defense. And then I'll hand it over to our great panelists here to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Chris McKay. I worked for the NSA, US Cybercom, and the Air Force for 8 years as an offensive cyber hacker, and did a lot of very interesting work there. Right now, I work to help secure the networks of private industry.
Hi, my name is Joshua Steinman. I'm a former naval officer, and then for 4 years, I was the senior director for cyber on the National Security Council at the White House, and I recently founded an industrial control systems cybersecurity company.
Hi, I'm Michael Ellis. I'm a lawyer by training, served on the staff of the House Intelligence Committee for 3.5 years, and then worked with Josh in the administration, first at the National Security Council legal office, and then as senior director for intelligence programs at the National Security Council. Served for a few months as general counsel of NSA, and now I'm a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation for Law and Technology, and recently started my own legal practice focusing on providing advice to tech startups and other companies that need to work with the government.
Awesome. Well, clearly smart in the tech world. So Josh, so this first question I'll pose to you, and then Chris and Michael, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. So Josh, you previously kind of ran the cyber shop at this former administration at the White House, and you currently run a successful, cyber business. And so I would love to hear your perspective, both as a former government employee and, as being a successful businessman in the private sector of, what is cyber? What is our major threat with it? And where is an area that you see the United States should look more into or invest more into that we're not already?
Thanks, Jordan. When people ask me the question of how should I think about cyber, what is cyber, the way that I describe it to folks is imagine that you have an abstract concept that you'll call a layer. And in reality, a layer would be like spoken words. Spoken words are layers because they allow us to move energy from one location to another with really minimal friction. Spoken words are a layer. Written words are another layer. It allows me to move information from one place to another with incredibly low friction. Money is a layer. The monetary layer enables us to move effort, labor, value from one location to another. Think about cyber as a layer. It's an information layer. It allows us to move information from one place to another. And so when you think about cyber, you have to think about really anything that has those qualities that allow you to move digital information from one place to another. And it's a little different than what most people will say when they say, oh, describe for me cyber. And the reason why I like to start from that kind of a first principle is because there are many things today that, in fact, most folks won't immediately connect with as being a cyber thing that, in fact, are. So your connected thermostat, or the gas pump that you're using to fill up your car. I think a little closer to home that most people talk about is like your phone and your digital watch and all that stuff, but there are connected coffee cups, connected sneakers, and that information layer is permeating. I've got an app on my phone that some friends of mine out in San Francisco just developed that allow me to take a 3D rendering of a space and mark information in space, and anyone else can see it. So I can take a 3D image from my phone right now of this facility right here, and I could drop a pin saying, like, that seat right there is 1B. That's information. It goes into a layer. And so when people think about or ask me about how do you think about threats, there's two things going on that are essentially colliding right now. The first thing is that we are creating that information layer here in the world today, and we don't really understand it, and it's minimizing friction, and that means that it has certain dynamics around it, which is that things that tap into that information layer tend to be cheaper, better, and faster. So we have lots of people that are like, oh, we should do something. Where the do something is connect a physical object to the information layer in order to achieve those types of optimizations. So that's one. Two is directly resulting from it. which is that now that we're informationatizing, or both, now that we're creating that layer, it's creating threats. And we don't understand those because we're not making conscious decisions to connect into that information layer. We're making these unconscious decisions. And so when people ask, like you did, what's the biggest threat? It's the fact that we essentially have to act against our own sort of best interests, right? Which is that we're trying to connect things into this information layer to achieve those types of optimizations, but at the same time, it's hard to understand that in fact that comes at great cost. And so what I'm investing my time in right now is industrial control systems cybersecurity company that I just started. And it's because we're connecting most critical infrastructure, most manufacturing facilities to the internet, to the information layer, carries a lot of risk that we're not really calculating.
Chris, Michael, you have any thoughts to add to that? About the threat and where we should invest?
So for an adversary, there's three main areas where they would, or reasons why they would want to do a cyber attack on a business or organization. One is immediate financial benefit. Two is an intelligence, and three is destruction. The first one, the immediate financial benefit, is what is most in the media. It's ransomware. And the reason why is because with ransomware, the attacker wants to be known. They want you to know that they are doing it because they want the ransom. And ransomware has been more and more in the news. In 2020, Cyber Analysis estimated that $350 million was paid out by US companies for ransomware, with a 311% increase from 2019. According to Varonis, the actual cost to a company because of business disruption is 5 to 10 times greater than the actual cost of the ransomware itself, with 7.5 billion potentially impacting the US economy. And that's where a lot of business leaders worry about. They worry about ransomware. But there's two other areas that are, I think, potentially even more serious. One is intelligence. And what that is a lot of companies do things like R&D. They have technology. They have very sensitive information. And for an adversary, they do a cost-benefit analysis. It's like an intel gain loss. In the military, intel gain loss is if you have access to, say, a terrorist information hub where you get all communications, you can destroy that and disrupt that terrorist cell for a few hours, maybe a couple days. Or you can continue to get all information and all the communications from the terrorists for a perpetual amount of time, find out their plans, and continue to work against that cell. In the same way, when an adversary gets access to a company, they need to determine, do I want to have this short-term financial gain, or try to learn of all the R&D, of all the technology they develop in the future? And for companies that have technology, things like Intel, Apple, Tesla, it would be very short-sighted for an attacker to do ransomware. It would be much more advantageous. What they do oftentimes is to stay hidden, to get deeper in the networks, get more files, use that, reverse engineer it, and potentially even try to add their malware into the firmware or software of that company in the research and development departments so that anyone who uses that product is infected, and so they can get more intelligence and spread further. A good example of this is a supply chain attack as SolarWinds. SolarWinds, over 100 US companies and a dozen federal agencies were infected, including Microsoft, Intel, Cisco, Deloitte. And none of them were ransomware. The reason why is because these companies had information that was more valuable than a $5 million payout. And these things oftentimes don't get reported because the point of an attacker is to stay hidden. And SolarWinds got discovered, but there's so many more attacks against companies that the adversary stays low and hidden that aren't discovered. Finally, the third area an attacker would try to do is destruction. And that sort of breaks into two things. One is immediate, which is more for political, like more if you did something that they hate, they don't like. Like this is one-off things, but what I want to really talk about is critical infrastructure. And for critical infrastructure, it's more than just power. Critical infrastructure is the financial sector. It is transportation. It is airports. It is the media. It is communication. It's the water supply. If an attacker and a foreign adversary gets access to these things, they won't detonate immediately because that would be an act of war. What they would do is they would get access to as much as they can, wait for the opportune time, wait for a major conflict, and then detonate it all at once. In 2015 to 2017, Ukraine faced disruptions to simultaneously their banking sector, their government, their transportation, airports, media, just throughout their entire public and private sectors. In Georgia in 2019, they had between 2 and 15,000 websites taken down simultaneously from both private and public sector. So that is something it's a huge issue in the United States. 85% of critical infrastructure is privately owned. They're not mandated to protect their networks. And an issue oftentimes, the Colonial Pipeline is an outlier, but oftentimes an attacker will get into a lot of networks and stay hidden. And the reason why they will stay hidden is because once you use a vulnerability up, it's used up. And the reason why is because if 100 companies have the same vulnerability and you detonate it on one, there will be research done to figure out why that company was taken down, and safeguards will put in place to prevent it from happening again. So adversarial will wait and wait and wait, and they can detonate the 100 companies at one time and cause a major effect. And a lot of times these vulnerabilities are hidden and dormant. And that's something that in the United States we're not really prepared for in case of a major conflict. And that's a vulnerability we really need to work on.
Well, I couldn't agree more with everything that Josh and Chris just stated. What I'll add is that from a legal perspective, our government is not organized well to counter these threats or to assist the private sector, because as Chris correctly noted, most of the key infrastructure is in private hands. The government is not well equipped to help the private sector defend itself. If Russian or Chinese bombers or missiles were hitting American factories, no one would suggest that the factory owners need to build air defense systems to defend themselves against these threats. We'd say, of course, the government should step in and help American businesses defend themselves. And what we are dealing with here, as I think both Josh and Chris noted, is nation-state adversaries, and frequently there are differing degrees of affiliation between the hackers and the nation-state. But we should be candid that there are sophisticated Russian, Chinese, Iranian, North Korean hackers who are capable, and no private company can attempt to withstand this on their own. However, as is the case in so many areas, our laws haven't caught up with where the technology is or where the threats lie. So we talk about the importance of defending critical infrastructure. Well, very good. We have an agency that's part of the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, charged with exactly this mission. The difficulty, though, is that CISA doesn't have a lot of the same expertise. It's been chronically under-resourced for years. And you have another agency, the National Security Agency, some Chris and his former colleagues' work, which has an awful lot of expertise and a lot of resources, but they don't have the authorities the legal authorities to step in and take action within the United States. And there are good reasons we don't want a foreign intelligence agency, which is what NSA and other elements of our intelligence community are. They're designed to collect information overseas and to take action overseas. There are good reasons that you wouldn't want them operating inside the United States on U.S. infrastructure. However, we have a mismatch between where the expertise lies and who has the authority to take action on it. On top of that, as is the case in other areas of government, there is a competing mishmash of other agencies that all want to have a slice of the pie. There are different regulators for different industries. If you're a publicly traded company, the Securities and Exchange Commission has something to say about your cybersecurity standards, and they will impose certain requirements upon you. To take the example, again, Colonial Pipeline. Well, after the Colonial Pipeline attack, it turned out who's in charge of pipeline security? The Transportation Security Administration, TSA. The same folks that are checking your bag at the airport are the ones in charge of cybersecurity for pipelines. Well, what does TSA know about cybersecurity? Very little, but they aren't going to waste time. They issued directives immediately following the Colonial Pipeline hack to attempt to assert themselves and their jurisdiction over this area. And So some of those pipelines probably lead to power plants, supplying them with natural gas or petroleum. Who has power plants? The Department of Energy, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and you see where this goes. That for each industry, there are different regulatory authorities that all impose slightly different standards on private industry, and there's no coherent policy because the one entity within the government, CISA, that could look at critical infrastructure writ large. And we should also take a step back and. Chris, I think, alluded to the fact that the definition of critical infrastructure is very broad. That should also give us some pause about the potential authority that CISA has, which, again, there are good things they should be doing, but shopping malls are critical infrastructure under this definition, which was stemmed from an order by President Obama. The movie theaters, the movie industry is critical infrastructure after the Sony Pictures hack in 2014 when the North Koreans took down. 16. Sorry. Well. After the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures, the entertainment industry became critical infrastructure. So obviously there are good examples of water treatment plants, power plants, things that everyone would agree are infrastructure. But as I guess has become the case with proposals in Congress for infrastructure funding, suddenly when regulatory authority is at stake, everything looks like infrastructure. So that's I guess maybe a fair place to start. But there is just a chronic problem in our government of an inability to match up the authorities and resources and expertise and do a better job of defending the private sector.
Yeah, and let's also not forget that when there's a case of some type of cyber incident at a private company, you have attorneys that are looking out for the best interests of their clients who are going to come in and going to probably push back pretty seriously when government entities want to get data off of those networks.
Right. I should never forget about the role of attorneys because, after all, when we're talking about a hack of a private company, we're also talking about a crime that's been committed. So, there's law enforcement equities that come into play, and this makes for a very complicated landscape for any private company that is trying to do the right thing and wants to help enlist the government to defend themselves, hopefully in advance of a hack, but certainly afterwards, to figure out what has happened and how those indicators of the vulnerability can be shared with other companies to help avoid a similar problem occurring at them.
So, Michael, you touched on, the threats of cyber and how it affects, anything that it touches, right? And you said that the U.S. government is poorly equipped to defend itself and to protect itself against different types of cyber attacks. I want to take that just one step further because, recently in the past few months, we saw how bad cyber attacks are in the sense of they really affect the day-to-day of Americans. With the attack on the pipeline, that pipeline stretched from Texas all the way up to New Jersey. And I don't know if anyone in this room was affected, but I was in California, and that was the first time I can remember that gas on the East Coast was way more than it was in California. California is notoriously known for having the worst gas prices. But during that time, people couldn't get gas. You were limited. It was extremely expensive. So what can people do, what can we do as former government officials, those in the private sector, to get Americans to care more about cyber, to better understand it, so that when they come in positions of power, whether it's in the business or in the government, they can get our ducks in a row so that we're able to better defend ourselves? What are your thoughts there?
Well, certainly there is, basic educational steps and best practices that everyone can adopt. And really for businesses, this is an area where planning, I think, is key. And, by the time a cyber incident occurs, if that is the point at which the CEO is asking the general counsel and CISO, Chief Information Security Officer of the company, what do we do? Then it's too late. You can't wait until that point to have a plan. It has to be something that everyone has internalized within a company and understands what needs to be done immediately, because time is really of the essence. And again, in a chaotic situation, after all the networks go down, it's too late to really affect matters. There are certainly some legislative proposals floating around in Congress, about requiring companies in critical infrastructure sectors to report cybersecurity incidents to the government. I think those are probably a helpful step. They should be paired with with steps to remove existing regulatory requirements to notify that are currently a patchwork, as I was describing, in different sectors. And we shouldn't just layer on more regulation. Rather, it should be a coherent approach that has a uniform standard and allows the private sector to operate more efficiently. But again, as Chris mentioned, I think correctly, we hear about only a small fraction of the cybersecurity incidents that occur, and there's the ones that companies publicly disclose, which some studies indicate are maybe just under a third of all cybersecurity incidents that are discovered. Most of these companies are just not disclosing because no one wants to share bad news, and their share price may be affected by it. Again, the law enforcement may show up. Most people don't want the FBI rooting through their files if they can avoid it. Nothing, just not necessarily that they're engaged in any nefarious behavior, just that it's a burden. And then, as Chris noted, there's the category of cybersecurity breaches that even the companies themselves are not aware of and individuals are not aware of because it's carried out by a foreign intelligence service who is going to just sit there quietly and observe and potentially be able to exploit the vulnerability in a time of crisis.
And I think Chris will probably have some more granular recommendations on this, but I want to just highlight something that Michael said, which is that best practices here are your friend for folks that own companies or help manage companies, because in many cases, not in all, not in most, but in many cases, a lot of these attacks are exploiting failures of leadership inside the company and failures of process, right? And so I know Chris will be able to talk a little bit more, but just very broadly, failure of leadership where the question is asking those simple process questions. Do we have a plan? Do we have very basic processes in place? Who's responsible for backups and passwords and very basic things? And then on the technical side, and like I said, I'll just defer to Chris, but just very briefly, in many cases, folks just don't understand the tools that they're using, right? And that can be buying software and not understanding how to optimally use that software in a secure manner. It can be buying equipment and not turning on basic security tools that are included with that equipment. But really, again, it has to do with understanding that what you're working with when you engage with the digital system is something that is not as clear and cut and dry as working with a physical system, and it requires an additional level of both technical and leadership diligence.
So one thing that is understandably oftentimes misunderstood is people wonder why the federal government doesn't do more to protect private companies and various infrastructures from cyber attack. And the reason why is because it is by design. So there is a certain amount of freedoms that we have. And so a lot of the government agencies cannot watch and monitor all the communications traffic going to private companies because of privacy laws. So there are programs such as under DHS and under CISA, NCATS, which provides free penetration testing and security vulnerability assessments for private businesses, for infrastructure, for state and local governments, but it's voluntary. It's completely voluntary. So it's up to companies to take that step to secure their networks. And like I said, a lot of people expect the government to step in. But the problem with that is, as I said, they would have to literally be monitoring the communications, which the government does not have the authority to do for all the private companies. So it's a huge matter of private companies ponying up the finances to secure their infrastructure. And something that is oftentimes also not as understood is a lot of the critical infrastructure, the most important things, are actually easier to exploit. And the reason for that is because when you think of things like power, nuclear, water, like the most basic things that we need, a lot of those things, it's surprising how many of those type of systems in the network somewhere, there's a Windows 2000 box or some really old system that's really easy exploitable. And the reason why they have that is because a lot of times the software for these control systems was written 20, 30 years ago, and they don't work on modern operating systems.
Well, the equipment is that
that old, yeah.
Back in 1996,
Yep.
when Windows 2000 was state of the art.
Exactly. I mean, and so people are able to exploit into those systems, and companies don't just upgrade the operating system, make it secure, because then they have to rewrite it, and they're afraid that, hey, what if something goes wrong, and we don't want to risk causing an issue to our electricity or power or water. But the issue is there's all these vulnerabilities, and as I've stated, adversaries, if they do get access to that, and I'm sure they are, like, I have to be careful what I'm able to say, but it is not difficult to get access to a lot of our most critical infrastructures. It's just a matter of time when things are enacted. And so it's very important for companies to not just wait until after a cyber attack, but to take the steps before one to secure themselves. And it is expensive, and it is a lot of resources, but it's something that is beneficial for the company. I think it's according to CFO, long-term stock prices for a large company goes down 1.8% even after the initial big downturn, permanently after a major breach. And after a breach, companies can spend millions of dollars on remediations, checking all their systems. It's actually beneficial to spend that money up front before an attack happens.
But I want to touch on something that you talked about, Chris, which is that he just talked about how after you buy a piece of industrial hardware, there are a lot of internal pushback to not shut that piece of equipment down and maybe do a technical update. But I think this touched on a really important point, which goes back to this point that I made about leadership, which is that you have these tensions in between silos inside companies. You have maybe an information security office, then you have an operations department. That operations department's being judged by their Lean Six Sigma requirements of 5 nines, 6 nines of uptime, right? And so you have someone from the IT department come in and say, hey, look, you're running this piece of equipment. I know you think it's not connected, but that little cord at the back says that it is. I know that it is because you're dialing in from home to make sure that the RPMs of the compressor are within the bounds of your safety guidelines. But that compressor is using Windows 2000, and there's a patch that we need to install, a critical security patch. And the operations people are going to say, what are you talking about? I've got 5 nines of uptime this year. Things been down for like 38 seconds once when there was a power outage and it had to kick over to our backup power supply and blah, blah, blah. But it's really up to leadership to start asking those hard questions. And again, you can understand what those hard questions are. There are resources out there. Chris could pitch his employer. I could pitch my company. Michael could pitch his legal services. But the point is that
NCATS is free.
Oh, yeah, well, or the DHS service. Right. But the point is that like asking about, like knowing as a leader, you have to ask that question of like, when was the last, like I want to, so for example, a question we used to ask all the time is there'd be an incident at a department or agency and we would ask, what's the inventory of every single computer in location X? And you'd be very surprised about how long it takes to get that. Once you get that, then you ask the question, okay, what operating systems are operating on each one of those computers? When were they last updated? You really have to dig into these questions because what you'll find, and in fact some of the biggest cyber attacks of the past 5 years have demonstrated, that in many cases it just takes one unpatched computer to get onto a network. Chris can maybe talk to that a little bit more.
Yep. And first I want to talk more about leadership. So the thing is with leadership is that oftentimes they want the warm and fuzzies. So with NCATS, it's a free government program. I don't work for them, and there's a reason I chose not to work for them. So more than 90% of the people who ask for vulnerability tests, so there's different levels of how intense a company can request to have the government check to see if they're secure. Over 90% of the companies want the lowest, most basic automated level. And that's because they just want the warm and fuzzies. They want someone to say, oh, we had a test and we were told we're okay. But the most low-level test doesn't tell you much. It doesn't. Just because you do the most basic vulnerability automated scanning says you're secure does not mean you're secure. And an issue also with leadership is oftentimes when tests are done to test the security of a company, oftentimes the person who's in charge of actually securing the network is put in charge of the test against his network. And that's something that I've seen time and time again, where if you put the person who's in charge of securing the network in charge of testing to see if it's secure, oftentimes they'll be like, hey, give me a one-day test, and it's not uncommon for them to literally just turn off all their systems, all the administrative systems that day, or to say you can only attack this one computer, and then they literally turn off that computer so that they tell leadership, hey, I have no vulnerabilities. So as a leader of a company, it's important that you directly interface with whoever is able to test your systems, or put someone in charge of that test who isn't also in charge of the defense. Because the person in charge of the defense wants to keep their job, so oftentimes they may skew the results of the tests towards to benefit themselves. But as said, the thing is that only one little box somewhere in the system is needed to completely compromise a network. And that's where defense in depth is vital. So I'll talk a little bit about defense in depth, and this is why cybersecurity is difficult. So in terms of phishing, and in terms of intruding into a network, the most common way is phishing. Number 2 is RDP. Number 3 is insecure software. And when I say insecure software, it could be something completely up to date, but there's a vulnerability found. But for phishing, so phishing will work. So phishing will work.
And phishing is when
phishing is when and you've seen this, when people send emails pretending to be someone else, trying to have you click on a link. And the reason it will work is because, well, first off, in general, 25% of people click on that. But no matter how good you train your employees and how good you put the filters. Last month, for example, I was asked to test the phishing defense of a company. But I didn't want to just send emails, that's too easy. So I looked to see, I found an externally vulnerable website that they had. I exploited into it, gained administrative access, and then I was able to send emails as that company, internal email to internal employees I found through LinkedIn. And I sent the email, I found their communications online and how it looks, copied that, put in the link, and I was able to get remote access to those machines and sensitive files within it. The blue team, the defensive, said, what do we tell the employees? They did nothing wrong. They opened an email that was sent from an internal administrative account with an email with the contents that looked exactly like what the company sends. And the thing is, those employees did nothing wrong. And the filters of the company for phishing did nothing wrong. I was able to bypass that. That's why there's defense in depth, and that's important. So defense in depth is you have that first layer. Now you have software on the machines, on every machine, that is security software. And once you have that security software, you need someone to hone that. Because security software is not the maximum amount of secure out of the box. Otherwise, it would break your productivity. So you need someone to be able to maximize the defense of that while not breaking productivity. Now, you'll still have malware that you're able to get on that first machine. The attackers are now going to want to go to other machines, especially valuable things like file servers or domain controllers. Now, do you have intrusion detection devices that will see attacks from one machine to the next? And if you do, you're going to have someone to refine the detections, because out of the box, the detections will either have 1 million detections a day or it'll have 0. So you need someone to know what the baseline of the company is, what's the regular communication, so that they can continue to refine it, continue to change it based on the vulnerabilities that are also discovered in the wild that constantly come. And then you need someone to monitor it. And then you need someone to act upon what is monitored. And then you need someone to test all of it. So there's all these different layers where if one part of your defense fails, there's another part of the defense, another part of the defense. And all that is expensive. It's very time consuming. But that's also one reason why companies are oftentimes hesitant to have a full cyber defensive strategy. And they want to just have the most basic and ask for, give me a very basic penetration test, give me warm and fuzzy, tell me I'm good. And they want to just believe they're good. But that's it. You're not secure based on hopes and wishes. It's important to actually spend the time to and know that you're secure, as secure as you can be, and have that defense in depth so that you can detect things within your network. It's extremely important.
Michael, did you have another point to add to that?
Well, I think one lesson for all of us is to stay on Chris's good side. You don't want him attacking your networks. But another aspect to all of this, though, is that when we talk about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea engaging in these kinds of attacks, whether directly from their government hackers or from shadowy groups inside these companies that operate under some degree of relationship with the government, whether it's directly controlling them or just turning a blind eye to their activities. And one other failing of U.S. policy over the last several years. We, Josh and I did our best to remedy it during our time in government, but I think there's still more to be done. Is creating a workable system of deterrence that these countries have not been paying the price for their activities. We talk about the SolarWinds operation, which has been attributed to the Russians, and the Microsoft Exchange hack recently attributed to the Chinese. And what has been the response of the Biden administration to these incidents so far? A few sanctions on individuals who were unlikely to ever come into contact with the U.S. financial system and had likely already hidden their assets so as to be outside of our sanctions regime. There be a few indictments of Russian or Chinese hackers who will never come to the U.S. and never come within reach of our law enforcement. It has been an underwhelming response so far from the Biden administration, and I think you will continue to see these attacks escalate until there's a consequence. There's obviously significant capabilities that the U.S. government has in this respect, those capabilities need to be deployed carefully and deliberately. But I fear that until workable system of deterrence is established, that we'll continue to see more and more attacks because it's an easy lesson to draw for the foreign hackers. We did it. We got away with it. They slapped us on the wrist, issued a sternly worded press release, and nothing more.
So I would like to turn it over to the audience for any questions. So feel free to raise your hand and ask your question to these guys if there's any questions out there.
We've talked a lot about what companies are doing terribly. When you see companies that have really strong cybersecurity defense in depth, what do you see in the leadership of those companies? What are they doing correctly?
So guidance that we issued over the past, from 17 to early 21, had certain types of qualities about it. So your mileage may vary. My former attorney here would tell you that this is not advice. I'm simply reporting to you what was said in official documents. And those recommendations that came out usually had a few different qualities. One is movement to shared services. So what do we mean by that? Despite what you may think about these companies on other matters of censorship or collusion with totalitarian governments, the heuristic is the larger the surface area, the more a company has to lose with compromise, the bigger their security team tends to be. And so whether it's using Microsoft products that are up to date and not pirated, Google products, Apple products, things like that, big companies, there are plenty others. What it means is an internal security team, if a company is using those cloud services, has an ability to see a broad range of attacks that might be targeting their user base of not just your company, but another company as well. And they can then transfer lessons learned, make improvements that will not only improve your security, but anyone else using those shared services security as well. So U.S. government documentation from 17 to 21, and I'm pretty sure this is just continuing now, is emphasizing move to shared services. That's one. A second that you can, again, find in official documentation, and again, this is not my advice, but I'm just reporting out what was advised previously, is using best practices to try and segment networks to the best possible ability. And network segmentation is really important when it comes to critical infrastructure. It can be really important when protecting what people call crown jewels of their company, like the Coca-Cola recipe, which is purported to be kept in parts in different locations, as an example of sort of partitioning information. I don't know, what else? What other major best practices? We've got shared services, network segmentation. Probably the leadership stuff is the final one, but most important would be along the lines of, and again, this is not advice, this is just me saying what was recommended in official documents, but access control is probably the biggest final thing where you can find official documentation saying It's really important. And what do we mean by access control? It can be everything from physical access to a facility, to a data center, to exactly getting on the machine, meaning like, are you using strong passwords? Are you using 2 or multi-factor authentication? Any number of other things. Do you have control over all the endpoints in your system? And if you have control over those endpoints, you imagine you could have control over access there too.
I think in terms of good leadership, going back to John Maxwell's speech yesterday with the cycle, understanding failure and growing from it and knowing that that's part of the process. So one thing I see that is done wrong sometimes is that the person in charge of the defense and information security is afraid of the leadership that, hey, if you make a mistake, you're out or you're going to get scolded. So they don't want to share the information. They don't want to share the results. They don't want to say, hey, we're failing in this, let's improve in this. So as a leader, knowing that you're not going to be ever perfectly secure and hearing and understanding and supporting the information security side of things and knowing that they're not going to pass every single test perfectly, but communicating with them and letting them feel free to speak and share the weaknesses so that they can be improved upon, knowing that failure and improving is part of the process. Something that sometimes happens is actually like they have, because sometimes it's like you have to get better every time, or that's what's given to the information security side of things. So they have a penetration test and they've had like 1,000 findings. In the next one, nothing was fixed, but the next one, there's 1,100, but the security person says, hey, there's only 100 this time. We improved, but they don't mention that, hey, you have 100 because you told the team don't report what you reported last time. That's because a lot of times that security person is afraid of the leadership. They're afraid to be honest with them. So being able to have an open communication with your staff and having them feel comfortable to talk to leadership and have that good dialogue and understanding that improving is a normal part of the process, that there will be vulnerabilities. Every company will have vulnerabilities. Some of them won't be as big as others, but that it's okay and there's ways to remediate that and that it just be a normal part of the process to continue to get better.
I have a quick question. So I know we've talked about the vulnerabilities of companies and of the U.S. government and, what we failed to do and what we should be doing to, be able to better defend ourselves from these cyber attacks. But how vulnerable is the average American? Are those that, might not have a complex system or have some type of technology that someone like China is looking at, hacking into so they can get it and steal our intellectual property theft. But a day-to-day average American, how vulnerable are we? And if so, what can we do to better protect ourselves?
There's a great idea in one of Nassim Taleb's books. He calls it the turkey fallacy, which is that a turkey wakes up, is born, hatches, and every day has a nice coop to live in and feed and range to go out and explore. And the turkey thinks, life's pretty good, tomorrow's going to be great. And that works until around November 10th one year. And so my concern when people say, well, look, I don't care if someone steals my credit card, I can just call Visa and cancel it.
It's more annoying than that, trust me.
Yeah. That's all well and good, but the concern that I have when people ask me this question has to do with, this word's overused, forgive me, existential risks. So what Chris was talking about, attacks against critical infrastructure, meaning like the ability to literally turn the faucet and have water come out, or electricity, or to have the traffic lights work, or if you have a electric car, have that work if it needs internet connectivity in order to operate. And so the advice that I give to people is scrutinize your daily life and make sure that you're prepared for bad things to happen. And be creative about what you think bad things might be. And that can be having backups of food and water, and any number of other things. Like make sure that you don't need the internet in order for your house to work. And then when corporate people ask me the same questions, I essentially take them through the same exercise, which is to say, can your business function without the internet? And many times people think the answer's yes. And then you start asking a few more questions, and the answer may not be yes.
I would just add to that, though, that one recent trend we've seen with ransomware attacks, at least, a few years ago, these were targeting individuals more and more, and they've really shifted away from that because individuals just don't have the same capability to pay that businesses do. And obviously, as Chris noted, ransomware attackers are not the full range of the problem, but it is part of it. These criminal organizations, they'll just like the John Dillinger, why did he rob banks? Where the money is? Like, why are they attacking businesses now? Because the business can pay. And an anecdote that particularly found intriguing was that recently there was a story that a ransomware attacker hacked an insurance company that provided cybersecurity insurance. Why? To figure out who their policyholders were, so they could then hack all of them and demand ransomware payments, because they knew that the companies would just go back to the insurer and that the companies would be able to pay out because they had been covered for exactly this kind of situation. Unsurprisingly, if this trend continues, no one will be able to buy cybersecurity insurance. The market, is already showing signs of strain because it's very difficult to price risk. And Josh could go on this for a while, I know, but and insurers are looking for ways not to pay out to corporate clients, and there's a real possibility that the market for cybersecurity insurance could unravel. Unless they can figure out a better way to price the risk. So for the average American, back to Jordan's question, still basic steps you should take to improve your security and be prepared the way Josh mentioned, but the average American isn't the target, at least in a lot of these attacks.
Simplifying things, I think there's 3 levels of targets. One is just the average American. 2, there's companies that cyber criminals may try to go after, but not devote all their energy towards. And 3, companies that nation states will have a huge team that will spend a large amount of time specifically targeting them. So each of these levels, there's different amounts of defenses that are needed. So for just the average American, I think the most important thing is password reuse. So if you use one password on one site that's compromised, because you are not a huge target, your password is sold in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, same as credit card for pennies per password. So if you have that password on some random forum somewhere that you forgot about, and that password is the same password to your bank, that's bought for pennies. They're sold in like 100,000 person bulk, and they just try them all. And if, say, even your password is one character different, they don't care. They have so many, they're just going to go to the next one. If you're someone who is a CEO of a company that is a multi-billion-dollar company, then you're more in the second tier, where they will spend resources. They're like, okay, we have this password for you. It doesn't work. Let's try to see if we can change that a little bit to make that work for you, because you are a specific target we want, because you're someone who's very important. And then you go to the 3rd tier, where you can have a team working for years just trying to get this one company or this one person. So there's different tiers depending on what position you have in life. So knowing how much of a target you are, again, that is how much security you have. But the most basic average American off the street, be careful for password reuse, I think is a #1 thing. But you're not going to have people spending day and night trying to get you. If you're not an easy target, they're just going to move on to the next person.
Well, I'm going to change my password now because I use the same one all the time. I think we have time for one quick question. I think there's a gentleman in the back. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mark Horsmeyer, Dean of Engineering here at Liberty University. My background is I worked at San Diego National Labs, where we had to classify information, and we were always told to separate any classified information, any information we didn't want out, because everybody could hack no matter what you had, what information you had, if you were on the current cloud or internet. So we heard a panel earlier, maybe yesterday, about Bitcoin and how fast money can transfer now and all this kind of thing. So it seems to me that the basic assumption is that the cybersecurity is whole when they make these assumptions, and that they can't be broken into. And I guess my background says I think everything can be broken into. Right? And I probably all do that too. By the way, personally, the Russians filed my IRS the things with different people in Mississippi about 3 years ago, because they broke into Blue Cross and Blue Shield and they got all my information. So when I hear the folks talking about the Bitcoin transferring money, I just get real nervous about it from a personal and from an intellectual level.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that if it's digital, if it's a human design system, it absolutely can be compromised. And I think this really goes back to some points that Chris was making over the past few minutes or the past hour, which is you have to think about defense in depth. And I think whether it's the monetary systems of transfer, whether it's your digital systems, I think the way to really address the problem is that, yeah, you have to have redundant mechanisms through which you can try and buy down risk. And that's a challenge, right? And that can mean passwords, it can mean identity access management, it can be partitioning off critical information, but really it's that you have to think about what can happen on a bad day and try and go through the exercise of thinking about how can you buy down that risk.
And yeah, you're exactly right. Anything given enough time, resources, and patience can be hacked into. That classified network, if one person just accidentally connects a network cable to it, or if one person plugs in their phone or plugs in a USB, and if someone wants your information enough, they may be on the phone, on USB. They may get into everything that's around it. So if one thing is plugged in, it's instantly exploited. And there's also the chance that if it's important enough and someone knows exactly what parts you need to replace on something, that part can have something embedded inside if it's something that's important enough. Not saying that your stuff is that important, but if something is like the most important thing to get and someone's willing to spend years to get that, then there's always ways to get around things. And hackers try to be creative. Like if you want someone's Facebook account, you might not go after their Facebook directly. You might hack their grandma, then use their grandma's account to get into your account. So there's always like ways to go around things, and you're exactly right. Everything can be hacked as long as you give enough time, patience, and money into it, and creativity.
Well, thank you all for your insight and for what you're doing for the U.S. government as well as for private entities to help protect against cyber attacks. So can we get a round of applause for them?